Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you here today. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm director of the Dickey Center, and I'm delighted you could join us for this discussion about changes in the world of international development. As we all know, this is, just from reading the newspapers, this is an area in which, like so much else, is constantly in flux because of new orthodoxies coming in, old orthodoxies going out, new ideas, new stakeholders, new participants, new sources of funding, a range of changes that force those who work in this field to always be on their toes. And there are few people better suited to discuss the changes in the world of development than Don Steinberg. Don is currently, I guess for the last few months, 8 months, president and CEO of World Learning Incorporated, which is an international nonprofit that provides education, exchange, and development programs in more than 60 countries. And I'm pleased to say has a good and close and working relationship with Dartmouth. For our purposes, it's at least as important that before he joined World Learning, he was the deputy administrator at USAID. And for those of you who have not yet worked in government, you should know that the deputy at any place like AID is the person who makes it run. And so there's not much about development that he doesn't know. He has worked on the Middle East and Africa. He worked on the reforms under USAID Forward, and as we were just chatting, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which was a major undertaking in the first Obama term. Don has previously served as Deputy President for Policy at the International Crisis Group. He served nearly 30 years in the government. He was Senior Director at the National Security Council for African Affairs. He was Deputy Press Secretary. He was Special Haiti Coordinator, Ambassador to Angola, and the President's Special Representative for Humanitarian Demining. He had many, many other postings in any number of different parts of the world, including one that was quite foreign, the Capitol Hill. He has written more than 100 articles on foreign policy. He has one in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, I believe. And he has written on Africa, gender, post-conflict reconstruction, children in armed conflict, disarmament, and many other issues. It's a great pleasure to welcome Don Steinberg here today to Dartmouth.
I really want to meet that guy. He sounds really cool. Thank you for coming out on a Friday afternoon, and I'm going to truncate my comments so we can make sure we get as much dialogue as possible, and I'm prepared to talk about anything and everything, including how to get a job within the U.S. government in development areas, non-governmental organizations, etc. But for the students who are here, I am so jealous of you if you are going into the world of development and international development. I've been in that world for 40 years now, and yes, I am that old. And I believe that your cohort is going to see the greatest period of change and hope and challenge in the history of development. You know, I left AID 8 months ago, and I got an early going away present from the president when he used words that I had helped write in the State of the Union address that year. And I want to read you what he said. He said, "The United States will join with our allies to eradicate extreme poverty in the next 2 decades. We will do this by connecting more people to the global economy, by empowering women, by giving our brightest young minds new opportunities to serve," and yes, he was talking about you, "by helping communities to feed, power, and educate themselves, by saving the world's children from preventable deaths, and by realizing the promise of an AIDS-free generation." So just think about that. The president said that we will join with our allies so that by the year 2035, there will be no extreme poverty in the world. Google in hearing him make that pledge, put money aside to start a poverty museum that they plan to launch in 2035, because their hope is that the only place you'll see poverty in the world by 2035 is in a museum. This is more than a pipe dream. This is a possibility. Working together, we have brought 600 million people across the poverty line in just the last 15 years. And by the poverty line, I'm referring to $1.25 per capita income a day. That's a drop of more than a third in just 15 years. We have seen real incomes rise in developing countries by 60% in that same period. Infant mortality has plunged by a third. Primary school enrollment rates up 15%. Last year, we had 7 million preventable child deaths, and that means child deaths in developing countries above the rate that they occur in developed countries. 7 million. Sounds like a big number, and it is. It's a tragic number, but it is by far the lowest number in my lifetime. It's more than half a reduction in just the last 10 years. We're also seeing a world in which democracy is more widespread. Take sub-Saharan Africa by itself. When I started in the world of development, you had 3 democracies in Africa. Today, you have more than 24. Indeed, never have so many of our partner countries in the development world been democracies. So as we look ahead to the world of development, I believe that the goal of building local capacity to eliminate extreme poverty is not only a goal, it is an organizing principle. I believe that if we single-mindedly say that is our effort to build local capacity to eliminate extreme poverty, that we can accomplish just about everything we need to in the development field. If we start to address the diseases of poverty, malaria, malnutrition, infant and maternal mortality, if we start to focus on education designed to empower people to move beyond a poverty situation, if we provide the housing and the jobs and the other opportunities necessary, I think we have an organizing principle for your generation to take us where we need to go in this field. And I think that's really important because we have had so many different organizing principles in the 40 years that I've been in this field. When I first came into the development field, we were all talking about import substituting industrialization, ISI. And that's not the Pakistani ISI, thank goodness. But we all believed at that point that agriculture was a backwater. As long as people were out in the countryside and rural areas, you could never develop your economy. And so it was all about moving people to cities and putting them in manufacturing plants and putting quotas and tariffs on imports so that you had the domestic market captured. Didn't work all that well. And then, as a backlash, we all moved into the notion of basic human needs. Closer, I believe, to what the real answer was, but we all focused then on how do you put the person at the center of the development drive. And then we started talking about health and education and housing and issues of human security. Then we said, you know, that's all great, but in order to produce that, you need massive infrastructure development. And so everyone was focused on roads and electricity and schools. It was almost like build it and development will come. We then moved into a period where we talked mostly about good governance. It was corruption and bad market conditions and lack of rule of law that had led to the failure of development work. The notion was you get the macroeconomics right and everything else will follow. I can't tell you the number of other policies. We talked about the political and security preconditions to growth. We all talked about agriculture then as the savior for developing countries as opposed to a backwater. We talked about gender, and if you just develop young girls and women, everything else will happen. And I'm a huge supporter of gender initiatives, but it is not a single organizing principle. Finally, under the Bush administration, it was trade and investment and not development assistance that was going to lead to success around the world. The problem is that as we bounce back and forth among these various priorities, we lose focus on the single thing that's most important, and that is our commitment to capacity building in developing countries that can end poverty. You know, I was fortunate because my first experience in development, which occurred some 40 years ago, crystallized this in my mind. I was a young master's degree. I had just gotten my master's from the University of Toronto in development economics. I was 22 years old. I joined the State Department. They sent me out to the Central African Republic, which is in the news these days, but up until just recently, no one had ever heard of. And I walked into the embassy my first day, and I said, okay, I'm ready to be an American diplomat. And my ambassador said, you know, we probably have enough diplomats here. We just got given $2 million by this U.S. Agency for International Development each year for the next 5 years to do a health project. And we want you to run that. Do you have any background? I've occasionally seen a doctor. The short answer was no. I had no background whatsoever, but you don't say no when you're asked something like that. And so I became the head of our project to recreate the rural health system in the province of Guam. Now, if you think the Central African Republic per se is off the radar screen, you know, they say about Guam that if it's not at the ends of the earth, you can at least see the ends of the earth from there. So I hopped in a Land Rover and drove up to Guam. And the first meetings I had up there were with the governor and the military commander and the mayor of the capital city. And I said, I'm here with $2 million. What should I do with it? Well, their eyes got really big. And they said, you know, we really don't have health problems in this community. What we need is an air-conditioned office building for government officials. I thought to myself, that's probably not what the ambassador meant by a rural health program. And so I went out with my Peace Corps volunteer friends, and they took me to the marketplace. And we sat under the venerable baobab trees, and they brought me into contact with the women traders at the market. And they had a much different story. They said that mothers and children were dying in vast numbers in the community from childbirth and preventable childhood diseases. They said that 40% of the children were severely stunted by lack of nutrition. They talked about malaria and diarrhea, schistosomiasis, no midwives, no birth attendants, no drugs, no clinics, unclean water. You know, they were realistic enough to realize that we weren't going to take the money and build a big fancy hospital for them. But that's not what they wanted. And they told us, put together emergency feeding programs for children and for pregnant and lactating women. They said, help train us to dig wells in the ground so that we can have clean water. They said, provide financial incentives for community health workers and midwives. They said, build small health huts around the district and just put some basic drugs in there for the really small things. And perhaps most importantly, they said, build our capacity because we know you're going to leave sometime soon, but we need to be able to keep this going. And that's what we did. And we put together these programs for training midwives and for building health huts and for basic services and clean water. I left the Central African Republic 2.5 years later, and we could already see significant declines in child mortality, in maternal mortality, in child stunting. And knowing that I had had an impact on these individuals living better lives, I was hooked. I was hooked on the notion of women in development. I was hooked on building capacity. And perhaps most importantly, I was hooked on a life of commitment to the concept of international development. I then went on to continue working in development and diplomacy in the Amazon region of Brazil, on the Borneo states of Malaysia, Mauritius, South Africa, Angola, Haiti, and that has only reinforced my views that capacity building and addressing extreme poverty is the way to go. In addition, the changes that we've seen over the past 40 years reinforce that concept, and I want to go through some of these changes as I've seen them. The first is simply that donors, foreign governments, are not the driving force behind development that they once were. If you think about the careers that many of you will have, they contrast dramatically with the career options that I had. When I came into development, it was basically USAID, you could join the Peace Corps maybe the World Bank. Today, for those of you who are going to go in development, you'll be working your careers with non-governmental organizations, with private contracting firms, with the social responsibility divisions of major corporations. You'll be working for foundations, regional development banks, technology firms. You'll be doing academic and research work at academic institutions. If you look at it a different way, you can look at it through the resource lens. In broad terms today, the United States government provides about $30 billion worth of development assistance around the world. I would remind you indeed that that's less than 1% of the federal budget. And when I was at USAID, I used to have to make that point all the time because there are polls where they ask the American people how much of the federal budget goes into foreign assistance, and the average that people say is 25%. And then you say, how much do you want to go into foreign assistance? And they say, oh, cut that by 5 times. So we only want 5% of our money going into foreign aid. And I always said, I'll take it. Give me that 5%. That said, that $30 billion contrasts with $38 billion that you as private citizens give to NGOs, church groups, and other institutions who are doing work abroad. So you're actually giving more money individually than the US government is spending. Additionally, $100 billion is coming from foreign residents in the United States who are sending remittances back to their country. Private investment, each year, $1 trillion. And the real money comes in the money that is generated within developing countries for their own development. That's $8 trillion. And so what this says to us is the name of the game now is partnerships. The name of the game is making strategic investments that leverage other people's money, that bring our individual goals together. One of the clearest lessons that I take from 40 years in development is that no government agency, no international organization, no NGO has a monopoly on good ideas, on ground truth, on financial or human resources, or on moral authority. We are better when we work together. At World Learning, we've taken that lesson seriously. We now have 55 partnerships that we're doing all around the world in some 24 countries to work on development. I'm really proud of a project that we have put together in Pakistan where we are training with our partners some 90,000 teachers to provide better education to 4 million kids, and education that's open to girls, education that is non-sectarian, an education that can compete with the madrasas that exist in that country. And if you have not yet read I Am Malala, you have to. It is the book for our generation, and please do so. I'm really pleased that that program joins others that we are doing in Egypt for STEM education. We're working with 25 NGOs in Sudan to build their capacity. We're now involved in eastern Lebanon, where refugees are flooding in from Syria and swamping the infrastructure there. And we're training people to learn to work together to provide dispute settlement mechanisms for them. We're working in Ethiopia, Jamaica, et cetera. And I'm really pleased to note today that we have just won a contract to provide assistance in Kosovo to reform their education programs called the Transformational Leadership Scholarships and Partnership Program. Whoever came up with that one was, needs to work on his branding. But what's most exciting here is that we're working with Dartmouth on this project. Indeed, Dartmouth is one of our closest partners in this exercise to build economic and political and social development in Kosovo. Kosovo is the newest country in Europe, and it's a pivotal country. It's testing whether Euro-Atlantic integration can be the answer to the long-term, centuries-old disputes within the country. And much of the work that we're going to be doing with Dartmouth involves training new leaders and preparing graduates for the workforce. This builds on the great work that Dartmouth has done with Kosovo, including primarily in the area of gender, in the area of mother-child health care and medical school education, in the area of entrepreneurship. It's a very exciting new development. It's going to involve 185 master's students coming to the United States and elsewhere, including many who will come here to Hanover. It involves 160 participants in professional certificate programs, and indeed it will build on the capacity building work that you have done here. And so I'm delighted to be able to announce that here today. Going back to the question of what has changed in the international community of development, I think the key thing that's changed is that we are in what we call an age of empowerment, where we have seen the democratization of development. We've got governments and civil society partners in developing countries simply won't accept the kind of arrogance that we had before, where policies made in Washington dictated what we did on the ground. They are demanding ownership over their own development drives. And with the rise in democracy and civil society in many of these countries, we are more confident that the partners that we pick actually reflect the voices and the aspirations of the citizens of those countries. A third point I wanted to stress is that we have learned as an international community that sustainable development has to be inclusive development. And I mean that in two sentences. Again, in two senses. When I first came into development, you measured whether you had succeeded or not on the basis of did per capita income grow. And so we used to say if you have sustained growth of 6 or 8 or 10% per capita income, you got development. Well, what we learned over a period of time is that growth has to be equitably distributed. It has to be free from corruption. It has to create jobs to address the demographic bulge that occurs in many developing countries. And it has to be reflected in improvements in housing and healthcare and education. You think about the Arab Spring. The social revolutions that occurred there occurred in countries that had sustained growth of 6 and 8 and 10% for decades. But it wasn't distributed. It wasn't reflected in people's lives. It was perceived as being corruptly taken from the people, and it didn't create jobs. The result was a social revolution. Obviously, in my mind, it was a revolution that had to occur, but you would have hoped that the growth could have reflected itself in improvements in people's lives. The second aspect, though, of inclusion is that previously marginalized groups have to be a part of this exercise. You simply cannot ignore the contributions of women, people with disabilities, the LGBT community, and yes, I hope Museveni hears that, displaced persons, indigenous populations, young people, the elderly, ethnic and religious minorities. These groups have to both contribute fully to national development and benefit from it. And if you think we're talking about, subgroups here, the groups I just mentioned represent 75% of the population in developing countries. So unless you're fully empowering them, you're giving up tremendous growth. And we have an expression at World Learning, nothing about them without them. And I think that's important to say, that let individuals from these groups guide your efforts. The final area I wanted to talk about in terms of changes is that today's cohort of development experts are dragging all of us into a new era of technology. Even guys like me have to be conversant in Datapaloozas and crowdsourcing and tech challenges and hackathons. I used to think all hackers were bad people. And now we're working with an organization that calls itself Random Hacks of Kindness. And whoever came up with that deserves a prize. I believe that your cohort will come up with the answer for how to maximize the impact of 6.5 billion cell phones that exist in the world right now. You think about it, 6.5 billion cell phones. That's going to impact everything we do in the development space, how we do education, how we do healthcare. We send high school kids overseas through World Learning, and up until a few years ago, we wouldn't allow them to take cell phones because we said, we don't want you to isolate yourself from the local environment. We want you to engage in them. And then they came back and said, that's great, except I was the only kid in that community that didn't have a cell phone. And this is talking about rural Ethiopia or Mozambique or Malaysia, the Borneo states. And if you think about what cell phones can do now, let me just give you one story about, I was out in Berkeley, and I was talking to an audience in my role as USAID deputy. And I was talking about malaria and the evils of malaria. And I had mentioned that I had malaria 8 times, which I have, and that the scariest time when you have malaria is the time between when you think you've got it, you start getting the headaches, the nausea, the eyes bulging, and when the test comes back. Because you don't want to take the curative dose prematurely. It's toxic. It's bad stuff. And yet, if you have cerebral malaria, for example, which I've had once, you can die in 24 hours from malaria. And yet, if you're in a rural area, it's usually 3 to 4 days before you get the test results back. So somebody in the audience said, well, don't they have cell phones there? And I said, yeah, but what does that have to do with anything? And the kid looked at me like I was, from another century and said, let me get back to you. So 6 weeks later, he calls up and says, we want to come visit you in Washington. I said, great. He walks in and he's got this device. It actually looks a lot like just this. And he says, okay, we figured it out. You put your cell phone here. You take a blood sample, put it here, takes a picture, puts it in, high resolution. There is a testing center where you can just send a picture and it electronically matches it up with other pictures. And within 5 minutes, you can have, with 95% certainty, whether you have malaria or not. So they said, here, you know, and I said, wow, you guys are onto something, this is exciting. They said, well, except it costs us $25,000 to put this together. And we know, you know, we can't even afford small doses of malaria suppressants around the world. We can barely support bed nets, which cost, you know, less than a couple of dollars. But they said, you take it. You send it to private investors. You send it to medical research companies. You figure out whether it'll work, and it's all yours. And we're doing that right now. We've got the cost down dramatically. And when we get it down all the way, we're going to save literally tens of thousands of lives each year. And this is because these kids, and I actually asked them, I said, well, how'd you do this? And they said, well, we made a pledge. Everyone who you talked to, about 10% of them got together, and we said, we will not play a computer game for the next amount of period until we solve this problem. And they said, we went to the medical research unit at Stanford, where they're doing great work in this space. We got our health people involved in this, and they produced it. Similar story, I went out to University of Denver, where there's students who are working on anti-trafficking. They are, you know, it's this typical, we think globally, work locally. And they've had this program going to address companies that engage in trafficked labor and to try to encourage boycotts of their products. So they have now figured out a way that you take your cell phone, you take your cell phone and you walk into Walmart or your smartphone actually. You walk into Walmart or Target, you take your cell phone, you put it up against the barcode of a product, pull it back, and it will tell you how much traffic labor was involved in producing that product. If you don't believe it, go to endslavery.org. They'll show you how to do it. It is not complete yet. They've got students at 8 campuses all around this country who are doing the research and putting the data in there. It should be ready fairly soon. If it works the way we all hope it will, the next thing they're going to do is to do it with child labor. The next thing they're going to do is to do it with conflict minerals. Then they're going to do tropical deforestation. And pretty soon, I believe you're going to be able to take your smartphone, walk into any retail institution, and you'll get an immediate social responsibility indicator for the product that you're about to buy. That's what the world's going to look like in your generation. That's the capacity that you have to take us into that new world. So I want to tell one last story because it sounds like, in part, I'm all focused on modern technology and these global trends. But at the same time, the last trip I took before I left government, I talked about my first trip to the Central African Republic. I want to talk about my last trip, and that was a trip to Central America. For years at AID, we had been watching as there has been a rising tide of gender-based violence throughout Central America. It is ridiculous. The rates of rape and domestic violence and femicide have spiraled out of control throughout that whole region. We're at the point now where there is more violence against women today than at the height of the civil wars that occurred in that region. And so, working with our friends at the State Department and under the instruction of Hillary Clinton, we put together some programs to address this. In the last trip I took was to Honduras and Mexico and Guatemala. And in Guatemala City, we looked at the project that we had put together with the Attorney General of Guatemala, a remarkably courageous woman, Claudia Paz y Paz. And this was what we called the 24-hour court. Until Claudia got in her position, domestic violence in Guatemala was not a crime. It was a cultural practice. She got the parliament, which is almost all men, to pass a law that said it is now a crime. But they slipped a little clause in there, and it said, you have to report this to a judge within 8 hours of it occurring. Now, if it occurs at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, how are you going to do that? So everyone was telling her, go back and get the law changed. And she said, no, I can't do that. They won't do it for me. So she figured out a way to address this, and she set up something called the 24-hour court. And we at AID and in the international community supported this. So you go to Guatemala City right now. You can go in at 2 o'clock in the morning. You walk in the front door. If you go to the right, you go to a normal court. If you go to the left, the first person you see is a doctor. And that doctor is going to treat you for domestic violence that's occurred and take evidence. Next person you see is a policeman who's going to, and usually actually a policewoman, who will advise you of what your rights are. Next person you see is a judge, if you decide to go that way and to prosecute the case. Then you meet a psychosocial counselor who will sit for as many hours as you want and start you on the path to recovery. And the last person you see is a counselor who will tell you what your options are, who will give you money if you need to go and stay in a hotel, who will go back to your house with you if you have to take your kids away from that house. And we literally went there in the dead of night, and there were women who were coming in the front door, and as you watched them go through this process, you saw them come back to life. They were getting confidence again. Their lives were starting to get rebuilt at that point. And then Claudia took us up country, and we went to a small village called Nabaj, which is in the foothills in the interior of Guatemala. And there we met women who had come together to put together a project supporting each other on the issue of domestic violence. They put together a one-stop shopping assistance effort for women who were in trouble. They put together lobbying efforts for their local government and for the federal government. They empowered women to stand up for themselves, and these are mostly illiterate women who had never even considered this before, and they were changing their society. But what was even more important for me, at a lunch that we did, after about halfway through the lunch, a man stood up, and he said, I want to tell you my story. He said, I grew up in a traditional Guatemalan family. My dad would come home every Friday night drunk and would beat my mother. And then he'd do the same thing on Saturday night. And I watched this my whole childhood. And I was a young kid. I couldn't do anything about it. I felt powerless. I felt impotent. He said, then when I grew up and got married, in order to prove that I was a man, I started beating my wife. And I did this for years and years and years. He said, I then heard about this group, and I came and I joined it, and I started watching other women and the impact that this had had on their lives. He said, I've been here for a year, and about 6 months ago, my wife gave birth to a boy, and I held that boy in my arms and looked down and said, enough is enough. This pattern stops with me. And he said, I'll never go back to abusing my wife or my family. It stops with me. And so if you think about all these broad trends that we've been talking about, the international changes, et cetera, the truth is it all boils down to making an impact on people's lives, making an impact on those women's lives, on that man's lives, the lives of women in the marketplace in the Central African Republic. And I would argue that there's nothing more important in terms of dedication of our lives than building a world that's capable of training young people to create a world that's prosperous and peaceful and democratic and respectful of human rights and respectful of human dignity. So I know I promised to truncate my comments and I went on for 40 minutes. I apologize for that, but I would love to take some questions, some answers, some observations. Please.
One second. So for your goal of eradicating poverty, what do you think is the most...
Tell me who you are and a little bit about yourself.
I'm Saisi. I'm a sophomore. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
so for your goal of eradicating poverty, what do you think is the most critical component to attack? Is there one holistic thing to attack, or do you think it's an adaptable situation that you'll just solve on a case-by-case basis in a country? Or do you think like you can start by eradicating poverty by increasing school education enrollment, that kind of thing?
No, I don't believe there's a single fix solution globally. I think it's very different in each society. I would argue that the things that I mentioned here are all necessities, basic health care, addressing, you know, for example, if you are stunted and your cognitive development is stunted in the first few years of life, there's no way to recover from that. So that if we cannot address issues of child health and child development, we're never going to be able to succeed in this space. You get hardwired, unfortunately. We know enough about cognitive development. That's an absolute essential. But I would also argue that it is essential to have political systems that allow for development to occur. You need a system that empowers each individual, a system that recognizes that development, as I said, is inclusive, and it doesn't just work for the rich or the powerful or the male or the straight or the abled populations. It doesn't just work for the European colonialists who came in. It works for indigenous populations. It works for, indeed, the entire population. I think that's vital. I would say girls' education is probably one of the most important aspects here. We all know that if you educate a boy, you educate one person. If you educate a girl, you educate a community. And the impact of educating girls on delaying childbirth, on delaying child marriage, on eliminating HIV/AIDS, on creating healthy families, on improvements in agriculture is just tremendous. There is one statistic that is just remarkable, and that is that if you could assure women around the world in the farming community of the same access to resources, to seeds, to fertilizer, to title on their land as men have in those same societies, you would increase agricultural production by 30%. And you'd feed 300 million people around the world simply by equalizing the power structure between men and women in the agricultural sector. So I think that's the whole nexus of issues. The other issue that I think is vital is handling the issues of post-conflict reconstruction, because if you look at the relationship between extreme poverty and national stability, it is true that most of the people who are extremely poor are in countries that have faced political disruption. And so I think that that's an important element as well, making sure that we finally get it right in terms of the relief, recovery, development continuum, in terms of building stable societies after conflict. Other thoughts? You don't ask questions, I'm going to ask you questions. Please.
ISI. Oh, I'm sorry. You talked about the various trajectories of development over time, ISI, and then human development, and now capacity building, but one of the challenges that I'm sure you're grappling with is how do you measure that? Because human development, you could measure it by number of inoculations or
Right.
number of girls in school or something like this. And capacity building is as we know, a more subjective, perhaps measure. It's difficult to quantify at times. So how do you know you've done what you're saying you're going to do? How do you know that you've done capacity building?
The key answer is patience. The key answer is recognizing that the programs that you're putting together, you're not going to be able to measure in the space of a year or 2 years or even 5 years. You're going to have the patience to realize that it's going to take generations after generations to reflect that. That's one short answer. The real answer, though, is that we've got to restructure how we do our monitoring and evaluation. Too frequently, we do it the way you just described. How many inoculations did you do? Well, that's an input into development. How much are you spending? How many inoculations? Frequently, we don't do it on that. We do it on outputs. So, you look at how many kids graduate from high school or whatever. The real measure is outcomes. And the real measure is, did that kid, we brag about the fact we're training 90,000 teachers in Pakistan, that's going to impact 4 million kids, it's going to improve their work, their et cetera, et cetera. The real question is, are those kids going to be more resilient, better able to integrate into a marketplace, better able to assert their rights as citizens in that society, better able to take care of their families? And that you can only measure over a period of time. You can have a quick fix measure. So I was saying before, if you build a school in West Africa and you use the United States government to build that school, we have estimated that that will cost you $600,000. That same school, if you do it through the private sector or an NGO from the United States, will cost you $450,000. That same school, if you do it through the host government, will cost you $300,000. And that same school, if you involve the community in producing it, will cost you $180,000. That's, right there, there's a metric. The other way to measure it for me is the ownership that the local community displays in the development field. And I will tell a story. It sounds apocryphal, but it's actually true. I went in one of the last trips I took at AID, I went out to a community where they were building a school. And I was told that some of the people here are paid laborers and some are volunteers. And you could tell the difference. The paid laborers weren't doing a damn thing. They were sitting, complaining, they were bitching about, how hot it was. They were over drinking water the whole time. The volunteers were working their butts off. And so I went up to one of the paid workers and I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm laying cement. I'm laying concrete." And I said, "Well, you're not doing a very good job." And I walked away. I talked to another one. I said, this was a volunteer. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm building a school to educate my kids." And if you can get that sense of ownership from individuals in a society, that's probably the best metric that you can have. Daniel.
I have two questions, and I have to wait for the mic because I tell everyone else to. The first is, would you please address the politics of development today? It seems like the era of Senator Helms is past, and there's sort of an agreement that America has to do its bit in the world, and that's bipartisan. But I'd be interested in your thoughts, since you've been much closer to this than certainly I have. The other question I have is really for the students. my insight into getting into government for young people is that without a master's or without veterans experience, it's very difficult right now. Would you counsel young people who want to be in the development world to, knock on the doors of NGOs and nonprofits such as yours first, or what do you think is necessary? And then beyond that, what kind of training do you think people need to get into the development world? Obviously, there are many different kinds, but
So on the first question, I think we have more of a consensus about the importance of international development and our willingness to put money into it than we've had in my lifetime right now. I think 9/11 was one big cause of that, and frankly, we have seen a doubling of our development assistance in the time since 9/11 occurred, and we have seen a tenfold increase in the amount of money going into countries that are the poorest of the poor. So we as a country gave about $900 million in 2000 to the poorest of the poor countries. Last year we gave $10 billion. And so I think there's an understanding more and more of the importance of this, and I think it stems from three places. I think we have, and I firmly believe this, we have a sense of morality, a sense of ethics, a sense of we have a devotion as a rich and wealthy country to share the benefits that we have received. I think more and more NGOs and church groups and even corporations are buying into that concept and selling it to their own constituents. And I firmly believe that as a moral principle. Secondly, I think we get it in the sense that our economic benefit derives from a wealthy world. We are in the situation right now where our markets overseas in Europe, Japan, elsewhere are stagnant. They're not going to grow in the future. We're not going to have expanding trade with those markets. Our fastest growing markets for exports, our fastest growing places for investment, the places where we're getting natural resources from are all the developing world. There's this fascinating statistic, 13 of the top 19 fastest growing markets for US goods are from countries that currently or in the past got development assistance. Countries like South Korea and South Africa and Brazil. And so I think people get the connection between prosperity overseas and jobs for American, and right now jobs is the real question. But I also think that the argument that this is in our national security interest is taking over. You know, we had General Petraeus, one of the last things he did before he left the US government was to come over and talk to USAID. And he said, you are doing our work. If you encourage development, I don't have to send my soldiers. He said, we're not going to fight our way out of Afghanistan. We're going to develop our way out of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan's a perfect example of that. The thing that gives me hope about Afghanistan is not how many policemen or military officials that we've trained, or not even the slightly more responsive government that exists today. It's the fact that that country has gone through a remarkable period of rebirth in the last 14 years. There were no girls in school in 2000. Today there are 3 million. There were no girls, obviously, in high school graduating. Each year, 180,000 young girls graduate from high school. The most amazing statistic, and nobody ever has focused on it, life expectancy in Afghanistan has increased by 15 years in the last decade. The life expectancy when the Taliban was in place was 48 years. Today it's 63 years. And my belief is that the Afghan people will not go back to the old days. And that sense of movement and success is what really, I think, drives that development. I would also add one other thing, that when you go and you talk to members of Congress, they will tell you, you know, we know that countries that are peaceful and prosperous don't traffic in drugs, in people, or in weapons. They don't harbor terrorists or pirates. They don't transmit pandemic diseases that can affect us. They don't send off huge numbers of refugees that can come to our shores. And perhaps most importantly, they share Petraeus's view that they don't require American troops on the ground. And so I think that combination of ethical considerations, economic and political, and security has created a virtuous circle that will keep us going in good stead. You know as well as I do that the pool of people who apply for U.S. government positions is much greater than the number of positions we have. In general, in USAID itself, yeah, you do need a master's degree to come in. You can have equivalent service, however. But what really separates people when you apply for positions, whether it's at an NGO or a development for-profit organization or whatever, is international experience itself. And so I really believe that if you are going to get into the development world right now, you need to be doing semesters abroad. You need to be doing internships overseas. You need to take advantage of your summers and make sure that you're out there. First person I hired when I got to USAID did not have a master's degree, but had spent half of his junior year working on a fellowship program to help the Kenyan Human Rights Association, and spent another semester in Honduras working with their equivalent of the ACLU. And he could demonstrate that he knew, how to operate on that first day in the office. At World Learning, we do master's programs, but our master's programs, and I think this is necessary for everyone, are very practical, skill oriented. Yeah, you learn the principles and the ideas, but for example, you have to know monitoring and evaluation today in the development world. People demand that you know how to show that you've achieved results in what you do. And if you don't have that skill, you better get it quick. And if you have it, it should be prominently displayed on your resume. I would say the same thing is true of inclusive development. Same thing is probably true of cost-benefit analysis. There's some basic skills that you need that I don't care if you have a master's or you don't have a master's or you have a PhD or you have postdoc work. If you can't do it, you're not going to be particularly useful. I would also say, however, that I pretty much agree with you that the standards that exist in outside government are probably more flexible in terms of receiving people. And anybody who wants a job at World Learning, just let me know. So. Please, one more.
Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm a student who's a sophomore from Vermont. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on sort of the USAID's stance on education for women and or your own personal views. The comment you made earlier in terms of regarding poverty and access to, to like better quality of life through education for women in particular, from what I heard, focused a lot on sort of the domestic roles of personal health and addressing that in terms of education. And I was wondering if you could either bridge the gap to like a more academic framework for education for women, or distinguish between the two and how they're approached by the USAID or otherwise. So
it's a great question because there are a number of different aspects of this. When you're talking about basic education, which is really the area I was talking about, each year that a girl stays in school, you can measure specific improvements in socioeconomic indicators, which I guess would be what you would describe as the domestic role. So a girl is much more likely to have a healthy family as an adult if she is literate. She is much more likely to take her children to get vaccinations, to weigh her children to make sure that they're not stunted, etc. She's much more likely to use contraception. She's much more likely to avoid unsafe sexual practices, so HIV/AIDS and STDs go down. She's much more likely to delay her first child, which creates healthier children. She's much more likely to resist being married off at a very young age. And I will tell you that child marriage is an international shame for all of us. That's basic education. What's actually very odd is that in most developing countries, if you get to the college level, university level, the gender balance flips. And generally, you will see more young women, more girls in college than you do men. And obviously it depends on the country involved, but the question then becomes, what do you do with that education? And where are you steered? And for me, I'm very concerned that in most developing countries, the glass ceiling applies not only to rising within an area, but getting into areas. So if you look at, Brazil, for example, most women who graduate from a college situation go into the accounting world or they go into law, but then lawyers have a lower status and a lower pay in Brazil than in just about any country on earth. And so these gender molds affect us throughout this area. But I have a true expert in this field sitting right here, so do you want to respond? I'm sitting here pontificating when we've got,
So I'm Annabelle Martin. I'm the faculty member here at Dartmouth, for those of you who don't know me, and the director of the Gender Research Institute. The question that I'm going to ask, I think, piggybacks off of, I think, your preoccupation, which I think you're
no,
right,
I want you to give answers.
is right on target. No, there's not an easy answer to this, and you know that. My concern about the framing of women and gender-related work is that it seems like when we speak about gender, we're only speaking about women, and we're not speaking about masculinity and femininity, about how these cultural notions of what is female, what is masculine, and I don't think there's real societal change or real profound societal change unless you do that. So basic education was highlighted as health, vaccinations for children, and these are all very traditional domestic roles for women.
Right.
When real change is when there are options, right? When men are also part of the conversation, when men are rethinking what it means to be, what masculinity means. So how does your organization, or does your organization include that?
My last story is all about changing domestic roles and changing people's visions. I just gave a presentation at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which talked about the role of men in improving the gender balance in peace negotiations, for example. And one of the things I said was, I frequently speak to United Nations officials who are going out and running peacekeeping programs. And I will sit there and look them in the eye and say, you have to involve women in these exercises because it's the right thing to do, and because the international agreements all say you're supposed to do it, and their eyes just glaze over. I'll say you have to do it because the vast majority of people who have been affected by the violence are women. They need to be part of the solution. Their eyes glaze over. I'll even get, these could be your wives and your daughters, their eyes glaze over. The only way it works with them is to say, oh, by the way, you know that a peace agreement that doesn't involve women is 82% more likely to fail. And your career is going to be identified with a failed peace process. If you want to, for example, if you want to know where that next military attack is coming from the rebels, don't ask your military commanders. Have someone go out and ask the women in the marketplace who are going to have to move their families because of that attack and know exactly what's... If you're putting together a demobilization program, don't ask the people who are running that program. Go and ask the women in the communities that they're coming back to, whether they're being raped by their husbands because they don't have a sense of what their role in that society is, or who are being subjected to other kinds of domestic violence. If you want to know whether that legal system is operating or the police is sensitive on gender issues, again, don't ask the police. Ask the woman who's trying to access the justice system or the police support. And then they get it. And then they say, oh, so how do I do this? So I'm convinced that you can't get at this through a massive effort to change people's attitudes. I just don't believe that works. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I was the American ambassador in Angola. We had a situation, we had 4 million kids who had witnessed a death in front of their eyes by the time they were 8 years old. They had seen someone be killed in front of their eyes. And I used to have groups coming in saying, we got to do psychosocial programs. Well, how are you going to do a psychosocial program for 4 million kids? How are you going to change those? So for me, it isn't a question of working one by one and trying to change that. For me, it's a question of changing behavior. And you change the behavior. And if there's any result that I've seen from the American Civil Rights Movement, for example, it's that same concept. You didn't have to make, that Southern redneck love the African American person next. You just had to make sure that he didn't lynch him, and then that he allowed him to go to your high school and then your college. And after a while, you broke down the barriers between them. And after a while, they recognized each other as real people. I think it's the same thing that's going to take place in the gender area. But my immediate concern is making sure that those women in Guatemala don't get raped by their husbands. So this is not an answer. This is just, what I think on this. And I'd be interested in anybody else's reaction. Daniel.
Okay, well, I'm not going to react. I completely agree with you. But on that note, I really want to thank Ambassador Don Steinberg for coming today and for speaking with us. And I have to say, it was one of the most moving talks I've heard since I came to Dickey. And I'm so really delighted you were here. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.